you first want to open up a new Unity project. I'm going to set mine as 2D and just name it to crafting, and then hit create. Once Unity has loaded up, I'm just going to change the camera background to black just so I can see everything a bit better, and then create a UI canvas. Most of this inventory system is going to be on the UI, so I'm just going to set up the scaling for that first, and then you want to make sure that it's set to your aspect ratio. And create a UI panel. This will be our background panel for the inventory UI, and just set that to whatever size you feel like. I'm going to create another panel on top of that, and this is going to be for the inventory crafting table itself. So I'm going to have two separate panels for the inventory system, one up the top for the crafting and one down the bottom for the inventory itself, which I'll create now. So the inventory panel is going to hold all of our items, whereas the crafting panel is going to have the 3x3 table and the output. And then on the inventory, you want to create a new panel, and this is actually going to hold our items, and it's going to be named item slot, and set it to a square shape and anchored center. And then on top of that, just name it item slot and create an image. That image is what will show our icon. And then back onto the inventory panel, add a new grid layout, and set the padding, make sure it's set to upper left. And then just scale the image to make sure you're able to see the panel behind it. And then we're just going to come back down and create a new folder and call that scripts. Open that up and right click, create a new C# script, and we're going to call this item SO. This is going to be our scriptable object that will hold all of our items. So first thing we want to do is remove both the update and the start function, because we won't be needing those, and change model behavior to scriptable object. And then I'm going to create a public sprite. This will hold the image for our item, and then create a public string, and it'll just be our item name. Then up the very top, we want to create a new asset menu. Set the file name and set the menu name. This just allows us to create the assets easily from inside the editor. And that's it. Save that and go back into Unity. And now when we right click, go to create, we should have item menu and new item. Now we want to right click, create another C# script, and this one we would call it recipe SO, and then open that up as well. And this will hold all of our recipes. So again, delete the update and start function, change it to scriptable object, create the asset menu so we can create our recipes easily. And you can put this in the same location as the items, so you can do item manager and then / new recipe. And then in here we're going to create a public array of items. We're just going to call this top row, and we want to set that to an array of 3 items, because we only want our table to be 3x3. Then again, another public array of items. We call this mid row and set that to 3 as well. And then another public list array of items, bottom row, and also define that to 3. And then we're going to also have a public item, and it's going to be our output. So we will define what items go into the 3x3 matrix through the scriptable object, and then the output item is what we'll receive back. So back onto our item slot, we want to add component and then add in a item slot and create a new script. And then just open that up with Visual Studio. And then we first want to create a new public item. We want to call this current item. This will hold what item we have currently in the item slot. And then we want to create a public image. And this will be our items image. And to get image, we're going to be using unityengine.ui. And then we're going to have a public rect transform called item transform. And this will allow us to move our item around. Then create a private canvas group, call it CG, and this will allow us to interact with our item. And then we're going to have a public canvas named canvas. Okay, then into our void start, we're going to have set CG to get component canvas group. And then we're going to create a new void. And then we're just going to call that update slot data. And in there, first off, we want to check if our current item is not equal to null. So if it does contain something, we want to set our item image.sprite to the current item.item icon. Oh, sorry, .sprite at the end there. And if it is null, so we'll put an else statement, we want to set our item image.sprite to be equal to null. Okay, and then in the start function, we just want to update the data. And now we want to include some more functions, and we want that to be the iDrag handler. And to get that, we need to be using Unity Engine.Event Systems. So we need the iDrag handler, the iPointerDown handler, and the iPointerUp handler. Just like that. And what that'll allow us to do is interact with our UI elements properly. And just add the voids that it tells you to. So you should now have 3 new voids down the bottom here. And you can get rid of the update function, we won't be needing that currently. And back up in our update slot data, at the end we just want to set our item.anchored position to be equal to vector 3.0. This just makes sure that our item is centered in its slot. And then in our, that's the wrong function, we need the iDrag handler. Just change that up the top and then import that void. There we go. Remove the default statement from the onDrag function. And then in there we want to see if our current item is not equal to null. And then set our item transform dot anchored position to be plus or equal to the event data dot delta divided by our canvas dot scale factor. This will just make sure that our mouse movements are properly scaled when we're moving items around on the canvas. And then delete the default statement on the onPointerUp. And then create a new bool called foundSlot. And then for each object, over object in eventData.hovered, which will return all the objects underneath the mouse currently on a UI canvas. We want to see if those objects are first not equal to our current item object, because we don't want to replace itself. And then we want to see if the object that we're over has an item slot, to make sure if we're able to place the item into the slot. Now if it does have an item slot component on it, we want to get the item slot component from it and just store it locally by doing overObject.getComponent. And then we want to get the item from it and also store that, so item SO, and then we just want to set that to our current item, and then we want to set the item slot that we just found and set its current item to our current item, and then set our current item to the previous current item. So we're practically swapping the items in the item slots in this function. And then we just want to update the item slots transform so that it's centered, so that the item is centered back into the middle of the item slot. So I'm going to do item slot dot transform dot anchor position is equal to vector 3.0, and then we just want to update the slot starter. And found slot will be equal to true. Then outside that for each statement, we just want to see if we haven't found the slot, so found slot is equal to false. We want to set our item dot transform anchored position, and we want to set that back to vector 3.0. So if we don't find an item slot, move the item back to our current item slot that it was in. We have to set the bool, just set that to false at the start. And then we want to move on to onPointerDown and remove the default statement and just set cg.blocksRaycast to be equal to false. And then down the bottom here we want to set that back to true. And that'll just make sure we don't pick up our own item when we're searching for things in the hovered event. So it turns it off on down and then turns it back on when we release the mouse. And you just want to save that script and head back into Unity. Now you have to assign some variables. So the item image is the image, and the rect transform is also the image. The canvas is the main canvas in your scene, and I'm just going to make that into a prefab so we're easily able to duplicate it later. Set the canvas. Now you're able to duplicate it and create all your inventory slots. Now you just want to save the project, go into your crafting table panel and create another panel. This will hold our crafting table, and when you set this to a square dimension and anchor it center, and just move it slightly to the left. I might make that a bit bigger. There we go. Then on this you want another grid layout, and set up the padding and the spacing. Make sure it's set to upper left, and then for the constraints we want a fixed column count. We want to set that to 3. And then place our item slot and duplicate it 9 times. I might just fix up the scaling of that again so it fits properly. Okay. And that'll be our input for our crafting. Yep. Then we'll create another UI panel, and this will be for our output. Set it centered, change it to a square panel, and move it slightly to the right. And this will be our output. So I'll name it that. And then you want to put another item slot onto that as well. Anchor that center, and set it to 0, 0 on the X and Y. And make sure you set the canvas to all of those. Okay, so now we're going to make our recipe manager, which will see if our recipes are complete in the table. So come back to the crafting table, add a new component, and call it recipe manager, and create that as a script, and then open that up in Visual Studio. The first thing we want to do is create a public array item slot, and we want to call it top row and set it to a new item slot with an array dimension of 3. And then do that the same for the mid and bottom row. And this will just handle where items go into which slot. After that's done, we want to create a private list of item slots, and we just want to call this all slots. And this will handle all the slots in one go. The 3 separate top, mid and bottom rows are just to make it easier to assign items to. Then I'm going to create a space just so I can see everything a bit better, and then create a public item slot, and it's going to be called our output slot. So this will be where the item ends up after the recipe is complete. And then just a private list of recipes, and set that to a new list. So this will be where all our recipes are stored, which we will get from the resources folder in our Unity project. So in our start function here, we're just going to go all slots.add the top row, the middle row and the bottom row. And then recipes.add range, and then we'll go to resources.load all, and we want to make sure we get the recipe scriptable objects, so we'll put that in there. And then it wants a path, so we do recipes and then /, and this is a folder we have to create in our Unity project, and we need to make sure that it's case sensitive. So back in our Unity project, we're going to right click, create a new folder. We're going to call this resources. Make sure it's spelled correctly, otherwise this won't work. And in the resources folder, create another folder and call this recipes. And make sure that's spelled the same as how you've typed it in Unity, in the code. And then we want to come down to an update function. And we want to first create a for each loop. And this is going to loop through all of our recipes. So we're going to have recipe SO, recipes in recipes, and then open that up, and then create a bool, and then name that correct placement and set it to true. And then we're going to create a list of items, and then name this all recipe slots, and we're going to do this the same as our slots up the top. And we're going to go all recipe slots.add recipes top row, the recipe mid row, and the recipe bottom row. So just keep the formatting the same between our table and the recipe itself. Okay, now we're going to create 2 more loops. So this is going to be an I loop, and it's just going to go up to 3. So it'll do the top row and all 3 items in the top row. And then our next loop is going to pick the rows itself. So it's going to go from 1 to 3, top to bottom, left to right. Okay, so in here we want to see if our all recipe slots, so I, which will be our top row for the first loop, and then N, which will be the first item in the top row. I want to see if it's not equal to null. And open that up, and then we want to see if our all slots, IN, is also not equal to null. So we're just making sure that our recipe item isn't null, and that our item in the crafting table is also not equal to null. Okay, and then we want to see if all recipe slots, item name, if it's not equal to the item in our slots name, the correct placement is false because both items don't match the placement in the recipe. And we just want to continue with the loop. So just go to the next item, set it to false, and continue. Okay, so if our allItems.currentItem is null, we also want to set our correct placement to false and continue. So we create an else statement and then just write the same again, correct placement is equal to false and continue. And then the same with all recipe slots, if it's equal to null, I'm going to create another else statement, and then we just want to put in, we want to first check to see if the slot itself, current item, is also not equal to null. And if that's not equal to null, then it has an item in it and it's not the same as the recipe, so we're going to set correct placement to false and continue. Okay, so if we have the correct placement, we want to create a new if statement and then correct placement. If that's correct, we want to set our output slot.currentItem. I want to set that to our recipe output, and then set our output slot, and we want to update the slot data. But if we don't have the correct placement, we want to set our output slot.currentItem to be equal to null because it's not correct, and we still want to update the data. And that's about it. That's all done. You can save it and head back into Unity, and then create a new folder in the resources. We want to call this items. This will just hold all of our item scriptable objects. I'm going to right click and hit create. I've got 2 item managers. I'll just fix that up. So if you have them named the same, it'll all just come under one item and it's just a lot easier to use. Just put a space there and that should fix that problem. So then we just want to right click, create item. I'm just going to call this triangle. I'm just going to use basic shapes for all my items. You can put in whatever textures you feel like. And I'm going to create a new sprite. Put it into my sprites folder. And just create a triangle. And while I'm here, I'll also create a hexagon and a circle. So those will be my 3 items. I now have to create the scriptable object for them. But you'll notice if I were to set the current sprite, it comes up as an odd rectangle, and that's because we're not using the sprite mesh. So you just want to tick that box and apply it to the prefab, and then you can remove the sprite. This just makes sure that all the sprites are displayed correctly. Okay, back into our items. And on the triangle, we just want to set the sprite to the triangle sprite and set the name to triangle, and do the same for both the circle and the hexagon. So again, you name it, set the sprite, and set the name. Okay, Okay, and then we're going to head into our recipes folder and create a new recipe. And I'm just going to name this hexagon recipe. And set the output to the hexagon. And then we have these three arrays, top, middle, and bottom row. And these align to the crafting table itself. So top row is going to be equal to the first item is the first one on the left, second item is the one in the middle, third item is the one on the right, and so on. So middle row, first item is the first one on the left. And I want to set it so the triangle's in the middle and the circle is also underneath it in the middle. And that's it. So the resources are automatically loaded from our script. And then to set items, I didn't have anything to manage that, so I'm just going to set them manually. And hit play. So our items load properly, and we've received an error. You have to make sure that you've set the rows and output. Okay, so the output goes into the output slot. The top row is going to be the first three. The mid row is the next three, and so on. Okay, that's all set up, and that'll allow our crafting to work properly, and hit play. Another error. We need to add a canvas group to our prefab, otherwise it'll keep finding itself over the event hovered. And that should fix that problem. And now we can move the item around, except it's duplicating. So we'll see if we can fix that as also in our item slot. Okay, so we're just going to look for the error. Okay, so on our drag it has to be plus equal to the event data delta. Otherwise it'll stay in the same spot, and we also want to update our own item slot data. And that should fix all the problems that we have, and if we hit play, we're now able to move items around properly. We can swap slots, and you're able to put them up into the crafting table. You're going to make sure they're in the correct order for things to work properly. And there you go, you get the hexagon. You can drag that back into your inventory, and that'll reset when you don't have the correct recipe in place. And then you can add as many recipes as you like by simply right-clicking, adding recipes and items, and that's it. Minecraft recipes in Unity.